Some tragedies look like medical mysteries, some look like freak reactions, and some aren't accidents at all. 48 hours after giving birth, a new mother slipped into a violent septic shock, so sudden, so catastrophic, that doctors fought hour by hour just to keep her alive. Her blood pressure crashed, her organs faltered. And within days, the unthinkable happened. Her hands and legs had to be removed to save her life. Everyone whispered that it was her body reacting badly to childbirth. A rare complication, something no one could have predicted. Her husband said the same thing, almost too quickly, almost too confidently. For months, nothing about her collapse made sense, until investigators found footage from a camera inside the one place no one thought to check. A camera that didn't just reveal what happened, it revealed who made it happen. Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe. Lauren Mitchell grew up in Durham, North Carolina, in a neighborhood where everyone knew your name and your business. She was the oldest of 3 children, born to parents who worked hard to provide a stable, middle-class life for their kids. Her father worked in construction management. Her mother taught elementary school, and their home was the kind of place where dinner happened at 6 o'clock every night, and church attendance on Sunday wasn't optional. It was just what you did. Lauren inherited her mother's kindness and her father's work ethic, qualities that made her popular in school, but never the type to seek attention. She was reliable, the friend who showed up when you needed help moving, the co-worker who covered your shift without complaint, the daughter who called home every Sunday without fail. When Lauren was 19, her father died suddenly from a massive heart attack. He was 53 years old, in the middle of a workday, gone before the ambulance arrived. The loss shattered something in their family structure, and Lauren, as the oldest, stepped into a role she hadn't asked for. She helped her mother navigate insurance paperwork and funeral arrangements. She picked up her younger siblings from school when her mother couldn't stop crying long enough to get in the car. She worked 2 part-time jobs while finishing her associate degree because the life insurance policy wasn't enough to cover everything. Her mother would later say that Lauren grew up too fast after her father died, that she learned to swallow her own grief to make room for everyone else's, that she became so focused on taking care of others that she forgot to protect herself. After graduating with her degree in dental hygiene, Lauren took a job at a pediatric dental practice in Raleigh. She loved working with children, loved the way they trusted her to make things better when they were scared, loved seeing their gap-toothed smiles when she gave them a sticker after a cleaning. Her co-workers described her as patient and gentle, the kind of person who could calm a screaming toddler with nothing but a soft voice and a steady hand. She rented a small apartment close to work, visited her mother every weekend, sent birthday cards to her siblings with handwritten notes inside, and lived a life that was simple but full. She dated occasionally, but nothing serious, nothing that felt like it was going anywhere. Until the summer of 2016, when a mutual friend invited her to a barbecue and she met Derek Hayes. Derek was different from the men she'd dated before. He was charming in a way that felt intentional, the kind of person who remembered details about conversations and used them later to make you feel special. He worked in medical equipment sales, drove a car that looked expensive even if it wasn't, wore cologne that lingered after he left a room. Lauren's friends thought he was a little too smooth, a little too quick with compliments, but Lauren saw something else. She saw a man who seemed confident and ambitious, who talked about building a future and making something of himself, who paid attention to her in ways that made her feel chosen. Her mother met him twice before expressing concern, asking Lauren in that careful way mothers do if she was sure about this man, if she'd really thought it through. Lauren assured her she had. She was 26 years old. She'd been through enough in her life to recognize something real when she found it. And Derek felt real. They dated for 18 months before Derek proposed. The engagement happened in December of 2017, on a weekend trip to the mountains where Derek had arranged for a photographer to capture the moment without Lauren knowing. The ring was modest, a single diamond on a thin band, but Derek told her he'd saved for months to afford it, that he wanted her to have something beautiful, even if it meant sacrificing other things. Lauren cried when he asked, not because the ring was perfect or because the setting was romantic, but because after years of taking care of everyone else, someone finally wanted to take care of her. They got married in June of 2018, a small ceremony with about 50 guests at a church in Durham, followed by a reception in the fellowship hall where her mother and aunts had made most of the food themselves. Derek seemed happy that day, smiling in photos, dancing with Lauren to a song he claimed was their song even though she couldn't remember him ever mentioning it before. They honeymooned in Charleston, South Carolina, a 3-day trip that Derek said was all he could manage because work was demanding and he couldn't take more time off. Lauren didn't push back, didn't complain that other couples got a week or 2 weeks, or a trip somewhere farther away. She was grateful for what she had, for a husband who worked hard, and a marriage that felt like the beginning of something stable. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Derek's version of their love story was already cracking. That the man who promised to take care of her was drowning in debt he'd hidden from everyone. That the future he described so confidently was built on lies he'd been telling long before they ever met. The cracks were small at first, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them, and Lauren wasn't looking. She was too busy planning the life they were supposed to build together, too trusting to imagine that the man she married might already be planning her death. Make sure you've subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because the warning signs in this case could save a life. Let's continue. The first year of marriage looks different for every couple, but for Lauren and Derek Hayes, it was a study in contrasts. On the surface, they functioned like any newlywed pair navigating shared space and merged routines, learning each other's habits and quirks in the mundane intimacy of daily life. Lauren would later describe those early months as happy but confusing, like trying to read a book with pages missing, where the story made sense in pieces but never quite came together as a whole. Derek was affectionate in public, attentive when friends visited, quick to put his arm around Lauren and call her babe, with the kind of ease that suggested genuine fondness. But alone, in the quiet hours of their apartment, something was different. Something Lauren couldn't quite name, but could definitely feel. The arguments started small, barely qualifying as arguments at all, just moments of tension that flared and faded without resolution. Lauren would suggest they start saving for a down payment on a house, and Derek would snap that she worried too much about money, that they were young and had plenty of time, that she needed to relax and trust him. She'd noticed charges on their credit card statement that didn't match Derek's explanations, purchases from stores he claimed he'd never visited, amounts that seemed too high for what he said he bought. When she asked about them, Derek's defensiveness escalated quickly into accusations that Lauren was being controlling, that she didn't appreciate how hard he worked, that her constant questions made him feel interrogated. Lauren, raised to value harmony over confrontation, would apologize and drop the subject, convincing herself she was making problems where none existed. By summer, the pattern was established. Derek worked late several nights a week, explaining that sales required client dinners and networking events, that his income depended on building relationships outside of office hours. Lauren accepted this without much pushback, even though she noticed Derek rarely came home smelling like restaurant food or bar drinks, rarely had stories about the clients he claimed to be entertaining. She focused on her own work, spent evenings with friends or visiting her mother, tried not to calculate how often she was sleeping alone in their bed. Her mother asked more than once if everything was okay between them, if Derek was treating her right. Lauren insisted everything was fine, that all couples went through adjustment periods, that she was happy. She said it enough times that she almost believed it herself. The pregnancy announcement in October of 2018 should have been a turning point. The kind of moment that brings couples together around a shared purpose. Lauren took the test on a Saturday morning while Derek was still asleep. Watched the 2 pink lines appear and felt a rush of emotion so powerful she had to sit down on the bathroom floor and cry. She'd wanted to be a mother for as long as she could remember, had spent years imagining what it would feel like to hold her own child, and now it was happening. When Derek woke up and she told him, His face went through a series of expressions too fast for her to categorize. Surprise giving way to something that looked almost like panic before settling into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's great," he said, hugging her with arms that felt stiff. "Wow, okay, we're going to be parents." Lauren told her mother that afternoon, barely able to contain her excitement, planning aloud how they'd turn the second bedroom into a nursery, what colors she wanted to paint, whether they should find out the baby's gender or wait until birth. Her mother hugged her tight and expressed genuine joy. But later, when Derek came over for dinner, she watched him carefully, noticed how he sat slightly apart from Lauren on the couch, how he checked his phone repeatedly during conversation, how he changed the subject whenever anyone mentioned baby-related costs or childcare plans. After they left, Lauren's mother called her sister and said, "Something about that man doesn't sit right with me. I can't put my finger on it, but he didn't seem happy about this pregnancy." What neither of them knew was that Derek's debt had reached $30,000 by November, spread across 4 credit cards he'd been juggling with minimum payments and cash advances. His sales numbers for the quarter were abysmal, barely meeting the threshold to keep his job, let alone earn the commissions he needed to stay afloat. The pregnancy felt like a noose tightening, another financial obligation he couldn't meet, another person depending on him when he could barely support himself. At work, Derek's complaints became more frequent and more bitter. He told colleagues the pregnancy was unplanned, that Lauren had pushed for it, that he felt trapped. None of that was true. They'd never even discussed trying for a baby, but Derek needed someone to blame, and Lauren wasn't there to defend herself. In November, Derek missed 3 out of 5 prenatal appointments, citing work emergencies Lauren couldn't verify. In December, he declined to help set up the nursery, claiming exhaustion from long hours. By January of 2019, Lauren had stopped expecting Derek to be present and started managing everything alone. She kept a journal, not to document problems, but to process feelings she couldn't share with anyone else. One entry from mid-January read, "I don't know what I did wrong. I thought he wanted this life with me. I thought we were building something together. Now it feels like I'm building it alone, and he's just watching from a distance, waiting for it to fall apart." That entry would later be read aloud in a courtroom, evidence of a woman who loved someone incapable of loving her back. We're just getting started with this story, and it's only going to get more intense from here. I want to know where all of you are watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. And if you've made it this far, type, "I am still here," so I can see who's really invested in hearing how this case unfolds. Your engagement means everything, so let me know you're with me. January of 2019 marked a shift in Derek Hayes. Not just in his behavior, but in something deeper, something that people who knew him would later describe as a kind of detachment, like he'd made a decision that freed him from having to pretend anymore. At work, a new hire joined the sales team, a woman named Vanessa Rodriguez, who was 26 years old, unmarried, child-free, and financially independent in ways that Derek found intoxicating. Vanessa was friendly to everyone, professional but warm, the type of person who brought homemade cookies to team meetings and remembered people's birthdays. Derek, who'd spent months resenting his pregnant wife and the life she represented, saw in Vanessa everything he'd convinced himself he wanted: freedom, possibility, a future unburdened by responsibilities he'd never asked for. Their friendship developed quickly, too quickly for workplace norms, though no one called it out at first. They started having coffee together before morning meetings, staying late to discuss strategy on accounts they weren't even working together, exchanging phone numbers under the guise of coordinating sales approaches. By February, Derek had removed his wedding ring at work, claiming it was uncomfortable, that it caught on things. Vanessa had no reason to question whether Derek was single. He acted single, talked about his apartment in the singular possessive like he lived alone, made references to weekend plans that involved friends and solo activities, but never a wife or a baby on the way. The texts between them started as work-related check-ins and evolved into something more personal. Conversations about their weekends and their goals and their frustrations with life in general. Vanessa would later testify, tearfully, that she'd been completely deceived, that Derek presented himself as an available man exploring a connection with someone who liked him back, that she had no idea Lauren existed until police showed up at her door in October, asking questions about an attempted murder investigation. She'd cry on the stand describing how Derek talked about feeling stuck in his life but wanting to change, how he'd mentioned financial stress but framed it as temporary, how he'd hinted at big changes coming soon without ever specifying what those changes might be. To Vanessa, Derek was charming and attentive, interested in her thoughts and opinions. To Lauren, Derek was increasingly absent, a husband in name only who seemed to resent her presence in his life. Lauren's pregnancy progressed through winter into spring with Derek barely participating. Her mother stepped in to fill the gaps Derek left, attending appointments with Lauren, helping prepare the nursery, washing tiny clothes and assembling furniture Derek refused to touch. One afternoon in March, while they were organizing the baby's closet, Lauren's mother confronted her directly. "Lauren, honey, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. Is Derek happy about this baby?" Lauren's hands stilled on the fabric in her lap. She didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that her mother put down the clothes and sat beside her on the floor. "He's just stressed about money," Lauren finally said, her voice small. "He wants to be a good provider, and I think he's scared he won't be able to give us what we need." Her mother studied her face, searching for truth behind the excuse. "Stress is one thing," she said carefully, "but he's not acting like a man who's worried. He's acting like a man who's checked out. There's a difference." Lauren defended Derek out of habit, out of loyalty, out of desperation to believe her marriage wasn't failing, but the conversation planted something in her mind that wouldn't go away. She started noticing things she'd been ignoring. How Derek showered immediately after coming home from supposed work dinners. How he angled his phone away when texts came through. How he flinched when she touched him unexpectedly. She didn't confront him because she was afraid of what he might confirm, afraid that asking questions would break something already fragile beyond repair. Instead, she wrote in her journal, pages and pages of observations and fears and questions she couldn't voice aloud. "I think he might be cheating on me," she wrote in early April. "I think he regrets marrying me. I think he wishes this baby didn't exist. I don't know what to do with any of that." By summer, Lauren was in her third trimester, exhausted and emotional and experiencing the normal physical discomforts of late pregnancy, swollen ankles, back pain, sleep disrupted by frequent bathroom trips, and a baby who kicked relentlessly against her ribs. Derek offered no comfort, no support, no acknowledgement that she was carrying his child. He spent more time away from home than ever before, entire weekends disappearing with vague explanations about networking opportunities that Lauren couldn't verify. August brought her baby shower, an afternoon celebration organized by her mother and friends. Derek arrived 90 minutes late and left before the gift opening ended, spending the time he was there scrolling through his phone with barely concealed impatience. Guests noticed. Friends pulled Lauren aside afterward, asking whether everything was okay, whether Derek was always this distant, whether she had support if things got difficult after the baby came. Lauren smiled and reassured everyone that Derek was just nervous about becoming a father, that he'd come around once the baby was actually here, that everything would be fine. She repeated that phrase like a protective charm, trying to will it into truth through repetition. Everything would be fine. Everything would be fine. Everything would be fine. It wasn't true, and on some level Lauren knew it, but admitting that meant confronting a future too terrifying to imagine. So she kept hoping, kept believing, kept trusting that the man she married would eventually show up and be the partner she desperately needed. What she didn't know was that Derek had already moved past hoping their situation would improve. He'd moved on to researching how to eliminate it entirely. If this story is resonating with you, if you recognize any of these warning signs or you're invested in seeing how this case ends, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone you care about. True crime content like this isn't just entertainment, it's education, and understanding how these situations develop could literally protect someone from experiencing the same tragedy. Let's keep going because the next part is where everything starts to unravel in ways no one could have predicted. September of 2019 brought a change in Derek's online behavior that investigators would later describe as chilling in its calculated precision. His search history, meticulously preserved on his work laptop and later recovered by forensic analysts, showed a man conducting research with the focus and dedication of someone preparing for an exam. Except Derek wasn't studying for a test. He was studying how to commit murder and make it look like natural causes. The searches began broadly in March, generic queries about postpartum complications and maternal mortality rates, the kind of thing someone might look up out of genuine concern or curiosity. But they narrowed quickly, becoming more specific, more technical, more focused on particular types of toxins and their effects on the human body. Can sepsis occur after childbirth was followed by symptoms of postpartum septic shock, which was followed by how long does sepsis take to kill you, which was followed by natural poisons that cause organ failure. Derek's research methodology was thorough, clicking through medical journals and toxicology websites and forums where people discussed rare substances with effects that mimicked natural illness. He spent particular time on pages discussing amatoxin, the deadly compound found in death cap mushrooms. Case studies of accidental poisonings revealed a pattern that appealed to Derek. Delayed gastrointestinal distress followed 48 to 72 hours later by catastrophic liver and kidney failure. Victims typically experience nausea and vomiting within hours of ingestion, followed by a deceptive recovery period where symptoms seem to improve, then sudden multi-organ collapse 2 to 3 days later. The timeline created distance between ingestion and critical symptoms, a buffer period where no one would connect his actions to Lauren's collapse. He researched detection methods, whether standard hospital toxicology screens would identify amatoxin, what specific tests would need to be ordered to confirm its presence. The answers he found were encouraging from his perspective. Most hospitals wouldn't think to test for mushroom toxins unless there was obvious reason to suspect poisoning, and postpartum sepsis provided perfect cover, a common enough complication that doctors would focus on treating infection without questioning its origin. Derek also learned that amatoxin had no antidote, that once consumed in sufficient quantity, it was nearly always fatal unless treated immediately with aggressive supportive care and potentially liver transplant. Treatment consisted mainly of hoping the patient's organs could withstand the assault long enough to eliminate the toxin naturally. He was looking for something that would kill Lauren definitively but slowly, something that would give him time to establish an alibi and appear appropriately devastated when she died. The insurance policy was already in place, purchased back in March with Lauren's knowledge but under false pretenses. Derek had presented it as responsible planning, explaining to Lauren that with a baby on the way they needed to protect each other financially in case something happened. Lauren, touched by what seemed like a rare moment of Derek thinking about their future, had agreed immediately, signing the paperwork without reading the details carefully. The policy was for $500,000, with Derek listed as sole beneficiary. It became active March 20th, giving Derek 7 months to plan how he'd actually use it. By October, his debt had grown to $35,000. Collection agencies were calling, and Derek's desperation had transformed into determination. His relationship with Vanessa deepened throughout the summer. Text messages between them, revealing a man constructing an alternate reality where Lauren didn't exist and Derek was free to pursue a relationship without complications. Vanessa, still unaware Derek was married, responded to his attention with increasing affection, telling friends she was seeing someone new who seemed really special, someone who made her feel like a priority. Derek told Vanessa he had big changes coming in his life, that he was working through some difficult situations but would have clarity soon, that he was excited about building a future with her. She interpreted this as vague career stress or family drama, not as a man plotting his pregnant wife's murder so he could cash in on her death and move on with someone else. By September, Derek had identified what he needed and where to find it. Online searches for where to buy death cap mushrooms and ethnobotanical shops near me led him to forums discussing specialty herb stores that sold dried mushroom powders for educational and research purposes, existing in a legal gray area where the sale wasn't explicitly illegal, but the intended use determined legality. He made a list of shops within driving distance of Raleigh, places small enough that they wouldn't have sophisticated security, but established enough to carry rare products. Nature's Apothecary in Durham met his criteria, an independent store run by an elderly herbalist who specialized in traditional remedies and exotic botanical specimens. Derek visited once in mid-September, posing as someone interested in ethnobotany and traditional medicine, asking general questions about the shop's inventory without making any purchases. On October 2, 2019, Derek returned to Nature's Apothecary with cash and a plan. He purchased dried deathcap mushroom powder, signing a liability waiver that required his real name, paying $85 for a small container that held more than enough amatoxin to kill multiple people. The transaction was captured on the shop's security camera, clear footage showing Derek's face as he examined the product, as he signed the paperwork, as he left the store with a small paper bag tucked under his arm. He stored the powder in his car's locked glove compartment, waiting for the right opportunity, waiting for Lauren to give birth so the timing would be perfect, so her death would seem like a tragic postpartum complication rather than what it actually was. Premeditated murder, disguised as a medical emergency. October 12, 2019, started like any other Saturday for Lauren Mitchell Hayes, except it didn't end that way. She woke around 2 in the morning to a sensation that felt like pressure releasing, a warm gush of fluid soaking through her pajamas and the sheets beneath her, and she knew immediately what was happening, even though this was her first pregnancy, and she'd never experienced it before. Her water had broken. The baby was coming. She reached over to shake Derek awake, her voice urgent but steady. "Derek, it's time. We need to go to the hospital." Derek stirred slowly, groggy and disoriented, taking several seconds to process what she was saying, before finally sitting up and turning on the bedside lamp. His face, when Lauren looked at it later in her memory, showed something she couldn't quite name. Not excitement or fear or joy, just a kind of resigned acknowledgement that events were now in motion he couldn't stop. They drove to WakeMed Raleigh campus, the hospital where Lauren had attended all her prenatal appointments and where she'd pre-registered for delivery weeks earlier. The drive took 20 minutes through empty streets, Lauren timing contractions on her phone app while Derek drove in silence, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. When they arrived at the maternity entrance, a nurse met them with a wheelchair, and Lauren was processed through intake quickly, her medical history already in the system, her room assignment predetermined. Derek followed behind, carrying the overnight bag Lauren had packed weeks ago, setting it down in the corner of the room without unpacking it or asking what she needed from it. Labor progressed steadily through the morning and into the afternoon. Lauren's mother arrived by 7 a.m., having driven straight to the hospital after receiving Lauren's text that she'd been admitted. She held Lauren's hand through contractions, offered ice chips and damp washcloths for her forehead, spoke encouragingly about how strong Lauren was, how soon she'd meet her baby, how everything was going to be okay. Derek sat in a chair across the room, scrolling through his phone, occasionally looking up when Lauren made sounds of pain, but never approaching the bed, never asking if there was anything he could do. The labor and delivery nurse noticed his detachment, made a note in her charting about father minimally engaged, but she'd seen plenty of nervous or overwhelmed partners before, and didn't think much of it beyond noting the observation. Lauren's labor lasted 14 hours, long enough to be exhausting but not so long as to be concerning, her body progressing through dilation and transition at a pace the medical team considered normal. When it came time to push, Derek moved closer to the bed at the nurse's insistence, standing where he could see but not actively participating, his face blank in a way that Lauren's mother found disturbing. At 4:17 p.m., after 40 minutes of pushing that left Lauren sweating and sobbing and absolutely spent, a baby boy entered the world with a strong cry and perfect APGAR scores. The delivering physician, Dr. Patricia Foster, placed the baby on Lauren's chest immediately, and Lauren burst into tears at the feeling of her son's warm, vernix-covered body against her skin. She looked up at Derek, expecting to see emotion matching hers, expecting shared joy in this moment they'd made a life together. But Derek's eyes were somewhere else, distant, already thinking about something beyond this room in this moment. They named him Caleb Mitchell Hayes, the middle name honoring Lauren's father, and for the first 2 days of his life, everything proceeded normally. Caleb nursed well, slept in typical newborn patterns of 2 to 3 hour stretches, passed his hearing test and his newborn screening blood work without any concerns. Lauren recovered from delivery without complications, her vital signs stable, her bleeding moderate but not excessive, her uterus contracting as it should. Dr. Foster examined her on October 13th and 14th, noting in her chart that Lauren's postpartum recovery was progressing exactly as expected. No fever, no signs of infection, no reason to extend her hospital stay beyond the standard 48-hour observation period. Derek's behavior during those 2 days became a subject of testimony months later. He visited sporadically, claiming he needed to go home to shower or to handle work obligations that couldn't wait, spending more time in the hospital cafeteria or in his car than in Lauren's room. When he was present, he held Caleb only when directly prompted by nurses, handling the baby awkwardly and handing him back quickly, as if relieved to be free of the responsibility. Multiple nurses documented their observations, noting that Derek seemed uncomfortable with the baby, that he rarely made eye contact with Lauren, that he spent most of his time on his phone texting someone or scrolling through what appeared to be social media. One nurse asked Lauren directly if everything was okay at home, if she felt supported by her partner, if she had concerns about going home with a newborn and a husband who seemed so disconnected. Lauren, exhausted and emotional and not ready to admit out loud what she was beginning to suspect, assured the nurse everything was fine, that Derek was just nervous about being a father, that he'd adjust once they got into a routine. On October 14th at 3 p.m., Dr. Foster signed Lauren's discharge orders. The paperwork included standard instructions about postpartum recovery, when to call if fever developed, how to monitor bleeding, when to follow up for her 6-week checkup. Lauren dressed Caleb in a tiny outfit her mother had bought, strapped him into the infant car seat they'd installed weeks ago, and let Derek carry him to the car while she walked slowly behind, still sore from delivery, her body moving carefully as it adjusted to no longer being pregnant. They drove home in silence, Lauren in the back seat next to Caleb's car seat, watching her son sleep, completely unaware that within 12 hours she'd be fighting for her life in the emergency room of the same hospital they'd just left. Thank you so much for sticking with this story and supporting this channel. Your viewership and engagement make it possible for us to keep creating detailed true crime content like this. If you want access to exclusive perks, behind-the-scenes content, and early releases of future documentaries, consider joining our YouTube membership. Your support directly helps us invest in better research and production quality. The link is in the description, and I truly appreciate every single person who chooses to support this work. Now let's get to what happened after Lauren got home from the hospital, because this is where Derek's plan went into action. October 14th, 2019, 5:45 p.m. The Hayes family arrived home from the hospital to their small 2-bedroom apartment, Lauren carrying instructions and discharge paperwork, while Derek managed the car seat and diaper bag. Lauren's mother had come directly from the hospital as well, following in her own car, and she immediately took charge of settling them in, organizing the baby supplies, preparing dinner while Lauren tried to breastfeed Caleb in the living room with uncertain, inexperienced movements. Derek disappeared into the bedroom, claiming he needed to lie down because he was exhausted from 2 days of hospital visits, a statement that made Lauren's mother bite her tongue to keep from pointing out that Derek hadn't been at the hospital for most of those 2 days anyway. The evening proceeded with the awkward rhythm of new parents figuring out routines, Caleb crying and needing to be fed, changed, soothed, held, crying again for reasons they couldn't identify. Lauren's mother helped with everything, showing Lauren how to swaddle properly, how to position Caleb for feeding, how to tell the difference between hungry cries and tired cries and uncomfortable cries. Derek remained largely absent from these lessons, staying in the bedroom with the door closed, emerging only when Lauren's mother called him for dinner around 7 p.m. They ate quickly, conversation minimal. Lauren focused on managing her postpartum discomfort, while also keeping an ear tuned to Caleb's bassinet, ready to jump up if he fussed. By 8 p.m., Lauren's mother had cleaned the kitchen, done a load of baby laundry, and confirmed multiple times that Lauren had her phone charged and nearby in case she needed help during the night. "Call me if you need anything," she said, hugging Lauren carefully to avoid putting pressure on her healing body. "I mean it, honey. Any time of day or night, you call me and I'll be here." Lauren walked her mother to the door, thanked her for everything, assured her they'd be fine, closed the door behind her, and felt the sudden weight of being alone with Derek and their newborn son. Derek had already retreated to the bedroom again, and Lauren spent the next hour managing Caleb's bedtime routine by herself, feeding him one more time, changing his diaper, laying him down in the bassinet next to their bed, praying he'd sleep for at least a few hours so she could rest. By 9:30 p.m., both Caleb and Lauren were asleep, exhausted from the day's transition from hospital to home. Derek lay awake in bed beside them, listening to Lauren's breathing deepen into sleep, listening to Caleb's small snuffling sounds, waiting for full darkness and full silence before making his move. Around 10:30 p.m., when he was certain both Lauren and the baby were deeply asleep, Derek got out of bed quietly and went to his car. The apartment complex parking lot was dimly lit, most units dark as residents settled in for the night, no one around to observe as Derek unlocked his glove compartment and removed the small container of powder he'd purchased 12 days earlier at Nature's Apothecary. He brought it inside, moving through the darkened living room to the kitchen, where he worked by the light of the under-cabinet LEDs, keeping noise to a minimum. Lauren had a nightly routine she'd maintained throughout her pregnancy, drinking a protein smoothie before bed to help with recovery and milk production, blending together frozen fruit, yogurt, a scoop of protein powder, sometimes a handful of spinach or a spoonful of peanut butter. The blender was already on the counter, the ingredients visible on the shelf, the routine so established that Derek knew exactly how to recreate it. He worked methodically, adding frozen strawberries and a banana to the blender cup, scooping plain Greek yogurt from the container in the fridge, measuring protein powder from the canister Lauren kept next to the coffee maker. Then Derek opened the container of deathcap mushroom powder. The substance looked innocuous, pale brown and finely ground, similar in texture to any other dried herb or spice. He used a measuring spoon to add approximately a quarter teaspoon to the blender, tapping it off the spoon and into the mixture below, a quantity small enough to be undetectable by taste or texture, but more than sufficient to cause catastrophic organ failure. He sealed the powder container, washed the measuring spoon thoroughly, and blended the smoothie on high speed for 30 seconds until everything was fully incorporated. The result looked exactly like Lauren's normal smoothie, thick and pink and flecked with tiny seeds from the strawberries, poured into her usual glass and carried to the bedroom where Lauren was still sleeping soundly. Derek set the glass on her nightstand and gently shook her shoulder. "Lauren, hey, I made your smoothie. Thought you might want it before you forget." Lauren stirred, disoriented by sleep and the physical exhaustion of recovery, blinking at Derek in the darkness and trying to process what he was saying. "Your smoothie," he repeated, pointing to the glass. "I know you always drink one before bed. Figured I'd make it for you tonight since you've been through so much." Lauren, touched by this small gesture of care from a husband who'd shown so little care over the past months, smiled sleepily and reached for the glass. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice rough with sleep. "That's really sweet." She drank the entire smoothie, pausing occasionally to breathe between swallows, the cold liquid soothing against her throat. Derek watched her drink it, every ounce, until the glass was empty, and Lauren was setting it back on the nightstand and snuggling down into her pillow, already drifting back toward sleep. "That was good," she mumbled, eyes closing. "Thanks for thinking of me." Derek took the glass to the kitchen, washed it thoroughly, wiped down the blender, disposed of the powder container in the outdoor dumpster behind their building, and returned to bed where he lay awake for another hour, listening to Lauren breathe, waiting for the first signs that the poison was taking effect. October 15th, 2019, began for Lauren Mitchell Hayes like any other morning in those first confusing days of new motherhood. Which is to say, it began with exhaustion and with Caleb's cries demanding attention before dawn had fully broken. She woke to feed him around 6 a.m., her body moving on autopilot, lifting him from the bassinet and positioning him at her breast while she fought to keep her eyes open. Derek slept through the feeding, or pretended to sleep, his back turned to her and the baby, offering no help and no acknowledgement that anything was happening in the bed beside him. Lauren felt normal at first, just tired, just sore from delivery, just overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive when she barely knew what she was doing. By mid-morning, things started to feel different. Lauren experienced waves of nausea that she initially attributed to fatigue and hormonal changes, the normal disruption of postpartum recovery. Her stomach cramped occasionally, nothing severe, just uncomfortable enough to make her move carefully and avoid certain positions. Derek left for work around 9 a.m., kissing Lauren's forehead in a gesture that might have seemed affectionate if she hadn't noticed how quickly he pulled away, how eager he seemed to be gone. "Call me if you need anything," he said, the offer hollow given his track record of being unavailable. And then he was out the door, leaving Lauren alone with Caleb and a body that was beginning to betray her in ways she didn't yet understand. The nausea intensified through the morning, building from uncomfortable to concerning, Lauren finding herself leaning over the bathroom sink trying to decide if she was actually going to vomit or if the sensation would pass. It didn't pass. By noon she was actively sick, throwing up everything in her stomach until there was nothing left but bile, her body heaving with contractions that made her incision site ache and her head pound. She tried calling Derek and got his voicemail, left a message saying she wasn't feeling well and could he come home. Received no response. She tried to convince herself this was normal, that lots of women felt sick after giving birth, that hormones and exhaustion could cause all kinds of symptoms. But the rational part of her brain was starting to send up warning signals that something was genuinely wrong. By 2 p.m., Lauren couldn't ignore it anymore. The nausea had been joined by severe abdominal pain, cramping that felt different from postpartum uterine contractions, sharper and more persistent, radiating across her entire belly in waves that made her curl up on the bathroom floor, because she couldn't stand upright anymore. She was trying to care for Caleb between bouts of illness, feeding him when he cried, changing his diaper with shaking hands, laying him in his bassinet and praying he'd stay content because she didn't have the strength to hold him anymore. When she called Derek again at 3 p.m., he finally answered, his voice carrying background noise that suggested he wasn't at work at all, but somewhere else entirely. "What's wrong?" he asked, impatient. And Lauren, too sick to analyze his tone, said, "I need you to come home, Derek. Something's not right. I can't stop throwing up and my stomach hurts so bad I can barely move." Derek arrived home around 4 p.m., walking into a scene of Lauren on the couch looking pale and sweaty, Caleb crying in his bassinet, the apartment smelling like illness. "Have you called your doctor?" Derek asked, maintaining distance, not approaching to check on her or comfort her. "They said it could be normal postpartum stuff," Lauren said. "But it's getting worse, Derek. I think something's really wrong." Derek suggested she wait a bit longer, see if it improved, take some Tylenol and try to rest. Lauren, too exhausted to argue and conditioned to trust her husband's judgment over her own instincts, agreed to wait. Derek left again around 5 p.m., claiming he needed to pick up medicine for her, but he didn't come back for 2 hours, and when he did return, he had no medicine, just more excuses. By 7 p.m., Lauren knew she was in serious trouble. Her fever had spiked to 100.2, measured with the temporal thermometer from Caleb's baby supplies. She was having difficulty focusing, her thoughts scattered and fuzzy, her vision occasionally blurring. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, her body working harder than it should to perform basic functions. She managed to call her mother, her voice barely above a whisper when Diane answered. "Mom, I need you. Something's wrong. I'm so sick." Diane heard the fear in her daughter's voice and didn't hesitate. "I'm coming right now. Hang on, baby. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Lauren hung up and immediately vomited again, her body rejecting everything, operating in crisis mode, shutting down systems to preserve core functions. When Diane arrived at 7:45 p.m., she took one look at Lauren and made an executive decision. "We're going to the hospital right now. Derek, help me get her to the car." Derek, cornered into participating, helped Lauren stand, supported her weight as she swayed dangerously, guided her to Diane's car while Diane grabbed Caleb and his diaper bag. They drove to WakeMed's emergency room, the same hospital where Lauren had given birth less than 72 hours earlier. Diane navigating through evening traffic with growing panic as Lauren's condition visibly deteriorated in the passenger seat beside her. By the time they pulled up to the ER entrance, Lauren was barely conscious, her skin clammy and pale, her breathing labored, her blood pressure crashing in ways that would trigger immediate alarm when the triage nurse checked her vital signs minutes later. Lauren Mitchell Hayes was unconscious when they brought her into the intensive care unit at 2:15 a.m. on October 16, 2019, her body fighting a battle it was rapidly losing. The medical team working her case had never seen postpartum sepsis present this aggressively, moving this fast, causing this much damage in such a compressed time frame. Dr. Raymond Cooper, the intensivist assigned to her care, stood at Lauren's bedside reviewing lab results that made no sense. Blood cultures that should have grown bacteria by now showing nothing. Antibiotics that should have stopped the infection's progression having zero effect. "This isn't tracking like normal sepsis," he told the resident working with him. "Something else is going on here. Something we're missing." By October 17th, Lauren had been on life support for over 30 hours. Machines breathing for her, while vasopressor medications worked to maintain blood pressure adequate enough to perfuse her vital organs. The new crisis emerged slowly, first noticed by the ICU nurse during a routine examination, when she checked Lauren's extremities and found them cold, mottled, without palpable pulses in her wrists or ankles. She called Dr. Cooper immediately, and he confirmed what the nurse suspected. Lauren's circulation was failing catastrophically. Blood flow to her limbs had decreased to levels incompatible with tissue survival, and if they didn't intervene immediately, gangrene would set in, and the resulting infection would kill her even if they managed to treat whatever was causing her current crisis. The family meeting happened in a small conference room adjacent to the ICU. Lauren's mother Diane sitting across from Dr. Cooper and a social worker, Derek standing against the wall with his arms crossed, his face carefully neutral. Dr. Cooper explained the situation in language designed to be clear without being gratuitously graphic, telling them that Lauren's extremities were dying, that tissue death had already begun in her fingers and toes, that the process was irreversible and would spread without surgical intervention. "We need to amputate," he said, letting those words settle before continuing. "Both hands, both legs below the knee. If we don't, the necrotic tissue will cause systemic infection and she will die. I know this is an impossible choice, but we're running out of time." Diane broke down immediately, sobbing into her hands while the social worker offered tissues and quiet support. Derek stayed silent. When Dr. Cooper asked if he understood what was being explained, Derek nodded once and said, "Do whatever you have to do to save her life." The words were appropriate, but the delivery felt wrong to everyone in that room. Too measured, too rehearsed, delivered without the raw emotion that should accompany a decision this horrific. They scheduled the first surgery for that afternoon, October 17th at 2 p.m., with orthopedic surgeon Dr. Michael Torres leading the procedure to remove both of Lauren's hands at the mid-forearm level. The surgery lasted 4 hours, complicated work to preserve as much viable tissue as possible, while removing everything that had already progressed beyond salvage. When Lauren came out of the operating room, her arms ended in bandaged stumps, and the reality of what had been lost was impossible to ignore. The second surgery followed the next day, October 18th, removing both of Lauren's legs below the knee. Another 5 hours of surgical intervention to save a life by permanently altering it. Derek maintained his strange composure throughout both procedures, arriving when nurses called to say Lauren was out of surgery, staying briefly, leaving without explanation. Diane noticed everything. She started documenting Derek's behavior in a small notebook, recording arrival times, departure times, his lack of questions about Lauren's prognosis, the way he never asked to see her immediately after surgery, never touched her bandaged limbs, never broke down the way grieving spouses do. She mentioned it to her sister over the phone one evening, standing in the hospital hallway while Derek sat in Lauren's room typing on his phone. "Something is wrong with him," she whispered. "I don't know what it is, but he's not acting right. He's acting like he's waiting for something, like he's expecting a different outcome than the one we got." Her sister told her that grief makes people react in strange ways, that maybe Derek was in shock, that she shouldn't read too much into it. But Diane couldn't shake the feeling that what she was witnessing wasn't grief at all. It was something else entirely, something that would finally have a name when detectives showed up 2 weeks later, asking questions about poison. October 20th, 2019, marked the first day Lauren Mitchell Hayes regained consciousness since her collapse 5 days earlier, emerging from sedation into a reality she couldn't immediately process. The first thing she tried to do was lift her hands to her face, an instinctive human gesture, except her hands didn't respond to the signals her brain was sending. She tried again, the confusion escalating into panic, her eyes flying open and looking down at her body where she expected to see her arms, and instead saw bandaged stumps ending at her elbows. The scream that came out of her was primal, the sound of someone discovering a loss so profound that language fails to adequately express it, and nurses rushed into the room to sedate her before the psychological trauma caused her blood pressure to spike dangerously. Dr. Raymond Cooper had treated countless ICU patients in his 15-year career, but Lauren's case haunted him in ways that kept him awake at night reviewing medical literature and lab results, trying to find an explanation that made sense. He called a case conference on October 21st, gathering the medical team that had been involved in Lauren's care, presenting her timeline and symptoms to a room full of specialists who all agreed the presentation was wrong for standard postpartum sepsis. Her blood cultures never grew anything, Dr. Cooper said, pulling up lab results on the conference room screen. We threw every antibiotic we have at her and got zero response. Her liver enzymes spiked faster than they should for bacterial sepsis. Her kidneys failed too quickly, and her coagulation factors crashed in a pattern I've never seen in a postpartum patient. Dr. Monica Patel, the infectious disease specialist who'd been consulted on Lauren's case, raised the question everyone was thinking but hesitant to voice. Have we considered that this might not be infection at all? That we might be looking at toxic exposure? The room went quiet. Dr. Cooper nodded slowly, acknowledging that the thought had occurred to him but seemed too unlikely to pursue seriously. What kind of toxin would present like this? He asked. Dr. Patel began listing possibilities: heavy metals, certain plant alkaloids, mushroom toxins, all of which could cause the rapid organ failure and vascular collapse that Lauren experienced, all of which would require specific testing beyond standard toxicology screens to detect. They ordered comprehensive testing on October 21st, sending Lauren's blood and urine samples to a specialized laboratory with instructions to screen for an extended panel of organic and inorganic toxins. The results would take several days to process, but the decision to test for poisoning triggered hospital protocols that required notification of law enforcement if results came back positive for intentional toxin exposure. Meanwhile, Lauren underwent daily psychiatric evaluation, her mental state deteriorating as she grappled with the reality of her new body, asking questions no one could answer adequately. How will I hold my baby? And what did I do to deserve this? And why didn't the doctor stop it before it got this bad? Derek continued visiting sporadically, never staying longer than 30 minutes, offering generic statements like, "You're strong, you'll get through this," that felt obligatory rather than supportive. He never asked questions about her rehabilitation plan, never discussed how they'd manage at home with a newborn and Lauren's new disabilities, never engaged with the practical reality of their future. Diane, maintaining near constant presence at Lauren's bedside, filled her notebook with observations, not yet knowing she was documenting evidence for a criminal investigation. On October 23rd, the toxicology results came back positive for amatoxin, present in Lauren's blood at levels consistent with intentional poisoning. Dr. Patel read the results 3 times to make certain she wasn't misinterpreting them, then immediately contacted hospital administration. Within an hour, hospital legal counsel had contacted Raleigh Police Department to report a suspected poisoning case, providing Lauren's medical records and toxicology results as required by North Carolina law. The investigation that would ultimately unravel Derek Hayes' entire plan began with a phone call to Detective James Morrison, a veteran investigator with the Raleigh Police Department's Criminal Investigations Division, who listened to the hospital's report and immediately knew this case was going to be complicated, challenging, and potentially one of the most important he'd ever work. Detective James Morrison arrived at WakeMed on October 24, 2019, carrying a legal pad and a digital recorder, prepared to interview a victim who'd survived something most people don't survive, but lost nearly everything in the process. Hospital security escorted him to Lauren's room, where he found her awake but heavily medicated, her mother sitting beside the bed, both women looking exhausted and traumatized. Morrison introduced himself carefully, explaining that he was investigating unusual circumstances surrounding Lauren's collapse, that medical testing had revealed something concerning, that he needed to ask questions that might be difficult to answer. Lauren, still processing the loss of her limbs and barely holding herself together psychologically, nodded permission for him to proceed. The interview was brief, Lauren's ability to focus limited by medication and trauma, but she provided crucial information Morrison would follow up on extensively. She confirmed she'd felt completely healthy when discharged from the hospital on October 14th, that symptoms began late morning October 15th, that she'd consumed only food and drink she prepared herself, or that Derek prepared for her. When Morrison asked specifically about the evening of October 14th, whether Derek had given her anything to eat or drink, Lauren's face changed, a flicker of memory crossing her features. "He made me a smoothie," she said slowly. "My bedtime smoothie. He brought it to me, said he'd made it so I wouldn't have to get up. I thought it was sweet because he never does things like that." Morrison's expression remained neutral, but internally his investigative instincts activated immediately. A husband who rarely shows care suddenly preparing food for his wife hours before she experiences catastrophic poisoning. That wasn't coincidence. That was opportunity. He asked what was in the smoothie, whether it tasted different than normal, whether she'd noticed anything unusual about it. Lauren said it tasted fine, exactly like her normal smoothie, that she'd drunk all of it and thanked Derek for thinking of her. Morrison made detailed notes, asked for Derek's full name and contact information, asked about their relationship quality, whether there were marital problems, whether Derek had reason to want her dead. Lauren, still unable to process that her husband might have deliberately poisoned her, defended him initially, saying their marriage had struggles but Derek wouldn't hurt her, that he was the father of her child, that there had to be another explanation. Diane, who'd been listening silently from her chair, finally spoke up. "Detective, my son-in-law has been acting strange since Lauren collapsed. He's barely visited, he doesn't show emotion, he's been on his phone constantly like he's texting someone. And when the doctors told us they had to amputate, he didn't cry once, not once. I've been watching him, and something is very wrong." Morrison asked Diane to elaborate, took notes on every observation she'd made, asked if she'd noticed anything concerning before Lauren's collapse. Diane mentioned Derek's absence during the pregnancy, his lack of engagement with the baby, his general coldness toward Lauren in recent months, his strange reaction when Lauren announced the pregnancy almost a year ago. Over the next 3 days, Morrison conducted a systematic series of interviews that painted a picture of Derek Hayes as a man with motive, means, and opportunity to commit attempted murder. He interviewed hospital staff who'd observed Derek's detachment during Lauren's delivery and subsequent crisis. He interviewed co-workers who testified about Derek's complaints regarding the pregnancy and his financial stress. He interviewed Vanessa Rodriguez, who broke down crying when she learned Derek was married with a newborn and admitted to having an affair with him, providing text messages that showed Derek discussing major life changes coming soon, just weeks before Lauren was poisoned. Morrison obtained a warrant for Derek's financial records and discovered $35,000 in hidden debt, plus a $500,000 life insurance policy on Lauren purchased just 7 months earlier. On October 26th, Morrison obtained a warrant for Derek's electronic devices based on suspicious circumstances and probable cause for attempted murder. Forensic analysts worked for 2 days extracting and analyzing data from Derek's work laptop, personal phone, and home computer, recovering months of deleted search history that documented extensive research into toxins, poisoning methods, postpartum complications, and specifically amatoxin and death cap mushrooms. The search terms were damning on their own, but the timeline was what sealed it. Research beginning in March, shortly after Derek purchased the life insurance policy, and intensifying through September as Lauren's due date approached. culminating in specific searches for where to purchase deathcap mushrooms just weeks before Lauren gave birth. Morrison now had motive. He had opportunity. He had evidence of premeditation, but he still needed to prove means, to find physical evidence connecting Derek to the actual toxin used to poison Lauren. That evidence was somewhere. Morrison was certain of it. He just had to figure out where Derek had obtained the mushroom powder and whether any record existed of that transaction. The break in the case came from methodical police work, the unglamorous task of checking every possible location where someone in the Raleigh area could purchase exotic botanical products, including toxic mushroom specimens. Detective Morrison compiled a list of 12 independent herb shops, specialty spice stores, and ethnobotanical retailers within a 50-mile radius of Derek Hayes' home and workplace. And on October 29th, he began systematically visiting each one with a photograph of Derek and a specific question. Have you sold deathcap mushroom powder or any amatoxin-containing products in the past 3 months? Most shop owners said no immediately, explaining they didn't carry such dangerous substances or only sold them with extensive documentation for legitimate research purposes. Morrison was halfway through his list when he arrived at Nature's Apothecary in Durham, a small storefront tucked between a used bookstore and a Vietnamese restaurant, its windows displaying jars of dried herbs and roots and powders in earth-toned containers. The owner, Harold Brennan, was 67 years old, had run the shop for 30 years, and took pride in his extensive knowledge of traditional medicine and rare botanical specimens. When Morrison showed him Derek's photo and asked his question, Harold's face registered immediate recognition. "Oh yeah, I remember him," Harold said. "Bought deathcap powder about a month ago, maybe late September or early October. Said it was for academic research." Morrison felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice steady. "Do you keep records of transactions like that?" Harold nodded, leading Morrison to a filing cabinet behind the counter, where he maintained liability waivers for controlled or potentially dangerous substances. He pulled Derek's waiver, dated October 2nd, 2019, signed with Derek's real name in surprisingly clear handwriting, acknowledging the purchase of dried deathcap mushroom powder and accepting full responsibility for its use. Morrison photographed the document with his phone, then asked the question that would make or break the case. "Mr. Brennan, do you have security cameras?" Harold confirmed he did, pointing to the small dome camera mounted above the register, explaining it was primarily for theft prevention, but recorded continuously with footage stored on a digital video recorder in the back room for 90 days before being overwritten. October 2nd was 37 days, ago, well within the retention window. Morrison obtained a warrant within 2 hours, returning to Nature's Apothecary that same afternoon with a forensic technician who copied the entire day's footage onto an encrypted hard drive, while Harold watched nervously, finally understanding that his routine transaction might have been used for something terrible. They reviewed the footage that evening at police headquarters, Morrison and 2 other investigators, crowding around a computer monitor as the technician queued up October 2nd, timestamp 14:47 hours. The video quality was better than Morrison expected. High-definition color with clear audio, no grainy black and white ambiguity that defense attorneys could exploit. They watched Derek enter the shop, approach the counter, engage in conversation with Harold about traditional medicine and research purposes, point to a product on the shelf behind Harold that Harold retrieved and placed on the counter. The camera captured everything. Derek examining the container, reading the label, asking questions about dosage and effects, signing the liability waiver with deliberate strokes, paying cash, accepting the small paper bag containing his purchase, leaving the shop with that bag tucked under his arm. Morrison replayed the footage 5 times, each viewing reinforcing what he already knew. This was definitive proof, undeniable evidence that Derek Hayes purchased the exact toxin found in Lauren's blood exactly 12 days before she was poisoned. The angle captured Derek's face clearly enough for positive identification. The timestamp provided precise documentation of when the transaction occurred. The audio recorded Derek claiming he needed the mushroom powder for toxicology research, which would be proven false once they confirmed he had no academic or professional connection to toxicology. This wasn't circumstantial evidence that required jury interpretation. This was Derek Hayes on camera buying poison, signing his real name to acknowledge receipt of that poison, walking out with it in his possession weeks before using it to nearly kill his wife. Morrison contacted the district attorney's office on October 31st with a complete evidence package. Medical records proving amatoxin poisoning, financial records establishing motive, digital forensics showing premeditation, witness testimony documenting Derek's suspicious behavior, and video surveillance proving means. The prosecutor reviewed everything and gave Morrison the authorization he'd been waiting for: arrest Derek Hayes for attempted first-degree murder. They scheduled the arrest for November 3rd, early morning, workplace location to minimize flight risk and maximize controlled environment. Morrison briefed his team, reviewed the arrest warrant one final time, and tried to sleep knowing that in less than 48 hours, they'd be taking into custody a man who'd tried to murder his wife while she was vulnerable, postpartum, caring for their newborn son, a man who'd shown no remorse and likely believed he'd gotten away with it. Derek Hayes was about to discover that surveillance cameras and meticulous police work had other plans. November 3rd, 2019, 6 a.m. Derek Hayes woke in his apartment, showered, dressed in business casual attire for another day of pretending his life was normal, and drove to his workplace parking lot completely unaware that 4 Raleigh Police Department vehicles were already positioned at strategic points around the building waiting for him to arrive. Detective Morrison sat in an unmarked sedan near the entrance with 3 uniformed officers in marked units providing backup, all of them briefed on the arrest protocol and prepared for the possibility that Derek might attempt to flee or resist. Morrison checked his watch at 7:40 a.m., knowing Derek typically arrived between 7:45 and 8, feeling the pre-arrest adrenaline that never quite goes away no matter how many times you do this. Derek's car pulled into the lot at 7:48 a.m., parking in his usual spot 3 rows from the building entrance. He gathered his briefcase and coffee cup, locked his car, and had taken perhaps 5 steps toward the building when Morrison and the uniformed officers converged on him from multiple directions. "Derek Hayes," Morrison said, badge visible, voice calm but authoritative. "Raleigh Police Department. Put your bag down and place your hands where I can see them." Derek froze, confusion and panic crossing his face in rapid succession, his head swiveling between Morrison and the officers now surrounding him. Processing that this was actually happening, that police were here for him, that whatever he'd convinced himself was over and buried was apparently neither. "What is this about?" Derek asked, voice rising with false indignation. The performance of an innocent man wrongly accused. Morrison didn't engage with the question, instead stating formally, "Derek Hayes, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Lauren Mitchell Hayes, poisoning with intent to kill, and related charges. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Derek's face went through another series of reactions: shock, denial, calculation, fear, settling finally on a kind of desperate defiance. "This is insane," he said loudly, aware that coworkers were beginning to arrive and witness this scene. "I didn't do anything. My wife was sick. You can't arrest me for that." Morrison, unmoved, repeated his instruction, and when Derek hesitated too long, 2 officers stepped forward and physically turned him around, cuffing his hands behind his back with practiced efficiency. They read Derek his Miranda rights there in the parking lot, while employees gathering for the workday watched with phones out recording video that would circulate on social media within hours. Derek was placed in the back of a patrol car, transported to police headquarters, processed through booking with fingerprints and photographs and property inventory. Every step documented per protocol to prevent any procedural errors that might compromise prosecution later. In the holding cell where they placed him temporarily, Derek sat on the metal bench with his head in his hands, his mind racing through everything that might have led police to him, wondering what evidence they had, whether he could still talk his way out of this. The interrogation began at 10 a.m. in a small windowless room with a table and 4 chairs. Morrison and his partner, Detective Lisa Park, sitting across from Derek, who'd declined to request an attorney immediately, still believing he could control the narrative if he just explained things correctly. Morrison started with softball questions, establishing Derek's timeline for October 14th and 15th, letting Derek construct his version of events before revealing what they actually knew. Derek claimed he'd been at work most of October 15th, that he came home when Lauren called saying she was sick, that he'd suggested waiting to see if she improved, that he'd been shocked when she ended up in the hospital losing her limbs. His story was smooth, rehearsed sounding, delivered with appropriate emotion at appropriate moments. Then Morrison opened his folder and began laying out evidence. "Derek, we have your search history from March through October. Thousands of searches about toxins, about amatoxins specifically, about how to poison someone and make it look like natural illness. How do you explain that?" Derek's face lost color, but he doubled down on denial. "I was researching for work. I sell medical equipment. I need to understand medical conditions." Morrison didn't argue, just pulled out more documents. "We have your financial records showing $35,000 in hidden debt and a $500,000 life insurance policy on Lauren. We have text messages between you and Vanessa Rodriguez where you discussed starting a new life. We have testimony from coworkers that you complained about the pregnancy and called it terrible timing." Derek's responses became increasingly defensive, claiming the debt was manageable, the insurance was responsible planning, the affair wasn't serious, the work complaints were just venting. Morrison let him talk himself into corners, then pulled out the final piece, still images from the surveillance footage showing Derek in Nature's Apothecary. Derek examining the death cap mushroom powder, Derek signing the liability waiver. "This is you on October 2nd, buying the exact poison that nearly killed your wife. The toxicology proves amatoxin poisoning. This video proves you purchased amatoxin. Lauren's testimony proves you made the smoothie she drank hours before collapsing. It's over, Derek." They played the video, the audio of Derek claiming he needed mushroom powder for research echoing in the small room, and Derek watched himself commit the crime he'd thought was untraceable, watched the evidence that would convict him play out in high-definition color. He said nothing for 5 full minutes, and when he finally spoke, his defense had shifted from denial to rationalization, blaming stress and financial pressure, and Lauren herself for getting pregnant, anything to avoid accepting responsibility for what he'd done. Morrison let him talk until Derek finally said the words that would seal his fate. "I need a lawyer." The interview ended, Derek was returned to his cell, and Morrison began preparing the evidence package for prosecution, knowing they had a case strong enough to put Derek Hayes in prison for the rest of his life. November 5th, 2019. Lauren Mitchell Hayes sat in her hospital bed, propped up on pillows with her mother beside her, when Detective Morrison and a police chaplain entered to deliver news that would reshape her understanding of everything she'd been through. Morrison had requested the chaplain's presence, knowing this conversation would be traumatic, that learning your husband tried to murder you while you were vulnerable and postpartum requires immediate emotional support that police detectives aren't trained to provide. Lauren looked up when they entered, her face still showing the toll of 2 weeks in intensive care followed by painful rehabilitation, her expression shifting to confusion when she saw their serious faces and formal demeanor. Morrison introduced himself properly, reminded Lauren they'd spoken briefly during his initial investigation, then asked if she was ready to hear what they'd discovered. Lauren nodded, her mother reaching out to hold her shoulder in the instinctive protective gesture of a parent who knows they can't actually shield their child from this pain but tries anyway. "Lauren," Morrison began carefully, "we've arrested Derek for attempting to murder you by poisoning. The toxicology results showed you were given amatoxin from death cap mushrooms, and our investigation proves Derek purchased that toxin on October 2nd and administered it to you on October 14th through the smoothie he made for you." The words hung in the air while Lauren's brain tried to process information that contradicted everything she wanted to believe about her husband, her marriage, her life. "No," she said immediately, shaking her head. "No. Derek wouldn't do that. He wouldn't hurt me. There has to be a mistake." Morrison, prepared for this response, pulled out his tablet and showed her the evidence. The search history documenting months of research, the financial records showing debt and insurance motive, the text messages with Vanessa proving the affair, and finally the surveillance footage from Nature's Apothecary showing Derek purchasing poison. Lauren watched the video in silence, her face transforming from disbelief to recognition to horror as she witnessed her husband buying the substance that destroyed her body, heard him claim it was for research purposes when the only thing he'd researched was how to kill her without getting caught. She broke. The emotional control she'd been maintaining for 2 weeks, shattering completely. Her sobs coming from somewhere deep and primal, where grief and betrayal intersect. Diane wrapped her arms around Lauren as much as possible, without causing physical pain to her healing amputation sites, murmuring words of comfort that felt inadequate against the magnitude of what Lauren was experiencing. The chaplain provided tissues and quiet presence, letting Lauren cry until she had no tears left, until the reality had settled enough for questions to form. "Why?" Lauren asked Morrison, her voice broken. "Why would he do this to me? We had a baby together. I loved him. I trusted him. Why would he want me dead?" Morrison explained the motive as gently as possible. The debt Derek had hidden. The insurance policy that would have paid out if Lauren died. The affair with a woman who didn't know Derek was married. Derek's resentment about the pregnancy and fatherhood. His calculation that Lauren's death disguised as postpartum complications would solve all his problems and give him a fresh start. Each revelation was another wound, another betrayal layered on top of the physical trauma Lauren had endured. She learned that Derek had been cheating on her throughout her entire pregnancy, that he'd complained about her and their baby to coworkers, that he'd researched how to kill her for months before actually doing it, that he'd watched her drink the poisoned smoothie, knowing what it would do to her, that he'd maintained his calm, detached demeanor even as she lost her limbs because he'd expected her to die and was simply waiting for that outcome. "He thought I would die," Lauren said, the realization settling over her with new horror. "He wasn't sad or distant because of shock or grief. He was waiting for me to die so he could collect the money." Morrison confirmed this assessment, explaining that Derek had shown no genuine emotion throughout her hospitalization, that his behavior had been consistent with someone waiting for an expected outcome, rather than someone devastated by unexpected tragedy. Lauren asked about Caleb, whether Derek had ever cared about their son or if the baby was just another obstacle in Derek's way, and Morrison had to tell her honestly that based on evidence and testimony, Derek had viewed Caleb as a burden, another financial obligation, another tie binding him to a life he wanted to escape. The conversation lasted an hour, Morrison answering every question Lauren had strength to ask, preparing her for what came next. Bail hearings, grand jury testimony, eventually a trial where she'd have to face Derek and relive this trauma in public. Lauren, still processing, asked if she had to participate, if there was any way to avoid seeing Derek again. Morrison explained that her testimony would be crucial, that Derek's defense would likely argue reasonable doubt without her direct account of events, that she had every legal right to refuse, but justice for what he'd done to her depended partially on her willingness to tell her story. Lauren looked down at where her hands should have been, at the stumps wrapped in bandages, at the reality of her permanently altered body, and something shifted in her expression from devastation to determination. "I'll testify," she said. "I'll tell them everything. He needs to pay for this, and I'm the only one who can make certain he does." The Wake County Courthouse on November 4, 2019, was packed with media and public observers for Derek Hayes' bail hearing, the case having captured regional attention for its horrifying details and the visceral nature of Lauren's injuries. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Voss represented the state, a prosecutor with 15 years of experience and a reputation for thorough preparation and aggressive pursuit of justice in violent crime cases. Derek sat beside his public defender, Thomas Ridley, dressed in orange jail scrubs, his face carefully blank as if he'd practiced neutrality in the mirror, understanding that any visible emotion could be interpreted and used against him. Judge Catherine Brooks presided, a no-nonsense jurist known for making decisions based strictly on law and evidence, rather than public pressure or media attention. Voss argued methodically for bail denial, presenting Derek as an extreme danger to Lauren specifically, and potentially to the community broadly, emphasizing that he'd attempted to murder his wife while she was vulnerable postpartum, that he'd hidden his crime skillfully enough to nearly succeed, that he'd shown zero remorse when confronted with evidence. She detailed his financial situation and the fact that his debt combined with unemployment following his arrest made him a significant flight risk, noting that Derek had no substantial ties to the community, beyond a mother who'd publicly stated she wouldn't support him financially or emotionally through this process. Voss read portions of Lauren's mother's victim impact statement describing Derek's cold behavior during Lauren's hospitalization, painting a picture of someone capable of watching his wife suffer catastrophically without displaying normal human compassion or guilt. Ridley's defense argument focused on constitutional principles, the presumption of innocence, Derek's lack of criminal history, his surrender without incident when arrested, his willingness to cooperate with booking procedures. He acknowledged the charges were serious, but argued that bail was designed to ensure court appearance, not to function as pretrial punishment. That the state's evidence, while substantial, didn't negate Derek's rights. Judge Brooks listened to both sides, reviewed the evidence summary, considered the nature of the crime and the victim's ongoing trauma, and rendered her decision without extended deliberation. Bail is denied. Mr. Hayes will remain in custody pending trial. The nature of these charges, combined with the severity of harm inflicted on the victim and the defendant's demonstrated capacity for calculated violence, presents an unacceptable risk to public safety, and specifically to Mrs. Hayes. Derek's face twitched slightly at the decision, but he maintained composure as bailiffs led him from the courtroom back to the Wake County Detention Center, where he'd remain for the duration of pretrial proceedings. In December, the case went before a grand jury that heard condensed versions of evidence Detective Morrison had compiled, medical testimony from Dr. Patel about the amatoxin poisoning, forensic testimony about Derek's search history and financial motive, testimony from Harold Brennan about the poison purchase, and video presentation of the surveillance footage. The grand jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning true bills on all charges: attempted first-degree murder, poisoning with intent to kill, assault with a deadly weapon, insurance fraud, and child endangerment. Derek was arraigned in January 2020, entering not guilty pleas across all counts. His defense strategy at that stage still focused on creating doubt about his intent and questioning whether the state could prove beyond reasonable doubt that he'd deliberately poisoned Lauren as opposed to some accidental exposure scenario. Pretrial motions consumed February as Ridley attempted to suppress various pieces of evidence, arguing Derek's search history was obtained through an overbroad warrant, that the surveillance footage violated his privacy rights, that statements made during his interrogation should be excluded because Miranda rights weren't properly observed. Judge Brooks denied every motion, finding that law enforcement had acted appropriately throughout their investigation, that warrants were supported by probable cause and specific to relevant evidence, that Derek had been fully advised of his rights and had voluntarily waived his right to counsel initially before later requesting an attorney. The prosecution offered a plea deal in late February: 35 years in prison with parole eligibility after 25 years, sparing Lauren the trauma of testifying at trial in exchange for Derek accepting responsibility. Derek rejected the plea, his decision driven partly by ego and partly by genuine belief that he could convince a jury the evidence was circumstantial, that coincidence and misunderstanding had been mistaken for criminal intent, that reasonable doubt existed. His attorney advised him that proceeding to trial was extraordinarily risky given the strength of evidence, but Derek insisted, perhaps unable to accept that his plan had failed so completely, perhaps convinced he could charm a jury the way he'd charmed employers and girlfriends throughout his life. Trial was scheduled for March 16, 2020, giving both sides approximately 6 weeks to prepare their cases, to interview witnesses, to develop strategies for presenting complex medical and forensic evidence to a jury of ordinary citizens who'd need to understand toxicology and digital forensics and circumstantial evidence chains. Jennifer Voss spent those weeks building a narrative that would walk jurors through Derek's plan step by step, showing premeditation and malice and complete disregard for human life. Thomas Ridley spent those weeks searching for cracks in the state's case, for alternate explanations that might create reasonable doubt, preparing to argue that terrible coincidence had been misinterpreted as deliberate crime. Both sides knew the trial would be intense, emotional, and heavily scrutinized, that the verdict would either validate Lauren's suffering by holding Derek accountable, or would compound her trauma by failing to deliver justice. March 18, 2020, the trial of State v. Derek Hayes began in Wake County Superior Court, before a jury of 12 citizens and 4 alternates, selected through 2 days of painstaking voir dire that screened for media exposure and bias, Assistant DA Jennifer Voss stood to deliver opening statements, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the jury with words designed to frame the entire case. This trial is about trust and betrayal, about a man who saw his wife's pregnancy not as a blessing, but as a burden, who saw his newborn son not as a gift, but as a financial drain, who saw his marriage vows not as sacred promises, but as obstacles to a life he wanted more. Derek Hayes didn't want to divorce his wife. Divorce meant splitting assets he didn't have and losing access to money he needed. He wanted her dead, and he planned meticulously for months how to make that happen in a way that wouldn't point back to him. Voss walked the jury through Derek's timeline methodically. The March insurance policy purchase, the months of research into toxins that began immediately afterward, the October poison acquisition just 12 days before Lauren gave birth, and the administration of that poison hours after Lauren came home from the hospital. She promised to show them video of Derek buying poison, digital evidence of him researching how to use it, medical evidence proving Lauren was poisoned with that exact substance, and testimony from Lauren herself about Derek making her the smoothie she consumed before collapsing. By the end of this trial, Voss concluded, you will have no doubt that Derek Hayes attempted to murder his wife Lauren for insurance money and the freedom to start a new life with his mistress, and you will find him guilty on every count because the evidence will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that he is. Thomas Ridley's opening was shorter, focused on the concept of reasonable doubt and the difference between suspicion and proof. The prosecutor wants you to believe that a series of coincidences and unfortunate timing equals deliberate murder, he told the jury. But coincidence is not a crime. Derek Hayes made mistakes in his marriage, yes. He had an affair, yes. He had financial problems, yes. But making mistakes doesn't make someone a murderer. The state will show you search history and financial records and surveillance footage, but they can't show you the moment Derek allegedly put poison in that smoothie, because that moment doesn't exist. They're asking you to fill in gaps with assumptions, and that's not how our justice system works. If you have doubt, reasonable doubt about whether Derek deliberately poisoned his wife, then you must find him not guilty. The prosecution's case unfolded over 5 days. Diane Mitchell testified about Derek's increasing distance during Lauren's pregnancy and his unexplained calm after her collapse. Dr. Patricia Foster confirmed Lauren's healthy delivery and normal postpartum status. Dr. Monica Patel explained amatoxin poisoning, showing how the symptoms matched Lauren's presentation exactly. Dr. Raymond Cooper described the amputation decision. Detective Morrison walked through his investigation systematically. The forensic analyst presented Derek's search history with specific queries displayed on courtroom monitors. Harold Brennan identified Derek and testified about the poison sale. The surveillance video played on a large screen, showing Derek purchasing the death cap mushroom powder. Vanessa Rodriguez provided evidence of the affair and Derek's lies. The insurance agent testified about policy details and Derek's specific questions about payouts. On March 23rd, Lauren testified via video link from the rehabilitation facility. The courtroom went completely silent as her image appeared on screen, as jurors saw for the first time the full extent of what Derek's actions had cost her. Lauren wore a simple shirt with short sleeves that didn't hide her prosthetic arms, the mechanical devices visible and shocking to people unaccustomed to seeing amputation. She spoke clearly despite obvious emotional difficulty, describing Derek's changes during pregnancy, the smoothie he made for her October 14th, and her devastation upon learning he'd poisoned her. When Jennifer Voss asked how Lauren felt when she learned Derek had poisoned her, Lauren's voice broke, but she pushed through. I felt like everything I'd believed about my life was a lie. I'd loved him, trusted him completely, and he tried to kill me for insurance money. He watched me drink poison knowing what it would do. Thomas Ridley's cross-examination was gentle, attempting to suggest Lauren might be mistaken about details given her trauma. Is it possible you're confused about the timeline, about who made what drinks? He asked. Lauren looked directly at the camera. I am not confused. Derek made me a smoothie October 14th around 10:30 p.m. I drank it. 12 hours later I was dying from amatoxin poisoning. Those are facts, not confusion. Ridley had no effective follow-up. The defense case lasted 1 day. Ridley called a character witness whose testimony was dismantled on cross-examination, and an expert toxicologist whose accidental exposure theory was thoroughly debunked. Derek chose not to testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right, leaving his version of events entirely unspoken. Closing arguments happened March 26th. Voss connected every piece of evidence into a coherent narrative of premeditated, attempted murder. Ridley argued coincidence and reasonable doubt, but his words felt hollow. The jury received instructions and began deliberating at 2 p.m. 21 hours later, March 27th at 11 a.m., the jury returned verdicts, guilty on all counts. Derek's hands trembled as each verdict was read, the only visible sign that reality had finally penetrated his denial. Lauren, watching via video link, broke down crying when she heard guilty. Sentencing was scheduled for April 10th. Justice had been served, but the verdict couldn't restore what Derek had taken. Sentencing happened April 10th, 2020, in the same courtroom where Derek Hayes had been convicted 2 weeks earlier. Judge Catherine Brooks presided over proceedings that would determine exactly how long Derek would spend in prison for attempting to murder his wife, though everyone present understood the sentence would effectively be life. Before imposing sentence, Judge Brooks allowed victim impact statements, beginning with Lauren's mother Diane, who spoke directly to the man who'd destroyed her daughter's body and nearly ended her life. "You took advantage of the most vulnerable moment in my daughter's life," Diane said, her voice shaking with controlled rage. "She'd just given birth to your son. She was tired and trusting and completely dependent on you for support, and you poisoned her. You watched her drink poison you'd put in her smoothie. You went to bed next to her knowing what was happening inside her body, and you waited for her to die. When she didn't die, when doctors had to remove her hands and legs to save her life, you didn't cry once. You checked your phone and made plans with your mistress and waited for an outcome that would let you collect money and move on. I hope you spend every single day of your life in prison thinking about what you did, because my daughter spends every day learning to live without the limbs you took from her." Lauren's statement was read by Jennifer Voss because Lauren wasn't strong enough to attend in person, her rehabilitation requiring intensive daily therapy that couldn't be interrupted even for this closure. "I trusted you completely," Lauren's words began. "I believed our marriage vows meant something, that becoming parents together would bring us closer, that you loved me the way I loved you. Instead, you saw me as an obstacle, as something standing between you and money you wanted, between you and a life with someone else. You tried to kill me while I was recovering from giving birth to our son. You poisoned me and watched me collapse and let me believe I was dying from some random medical complication, when really I was dying because of what you'd done. I survived. But I'll never be whole again. I'll never hold my son's hand, never feel his fingers wrap around mine, never run or dance or do 1,000 other things I took for granted before you decided my life was worth less than $500,000. I hope this haunts you, Derek. I hope every night in prison you think about what you tried to do and what you actually accomplished, which was destroying 2 lives, mine and yours." Derek was offered the opportunity to make a statement before sentencing. He stood, his voice catching as he attempted something resembling remorse. "I'm sorry for what happened to Lauren," he said, the passive construction revealing his continued inability to accept direct responsibility. "I never meant for things to go this far. I was stressed about money and being a father. I wasn't thinking clearly. I made terrible decisions that I'll regret for the rest of my life. I asked the court for mercy." Judge Brooks listened without visible reaction, then delivered her sentence with words chosen specifically to reflect the severity of Derek's crime and the calculated nature of his actions. "Mr. Hayes, you committed one of the most cruel and premeditated crimes this court has encountered. You researched for months how to poison your wife in a way that would appear natural. You purchased the toxin weeks in advance. You waited until she'd just given birth, until she was physically vulnerable and emotionally dependent on you, and you administered poison that you knew would cause agonizing organ failure. You showed no remorse as she suffered, no concern as her limbs died and had to be amputated, no humanity toward a woman who'd committed the crime of trusting you and bearing your child. The law allows this court to impose a sentence reflecting the gravity of your actions, and I intend to do exactly that. On the charge of attempted first-degree murder, life in prison without possibility of parole. On all other charges, maximum sentences to run consecutively. You will also pay restitution in the amount of $2 million to Lauren Hayes for medical expenses and ongoing care needs. You are prohibited from any contact with Lauren or your son Caleb, under penalty of additional criminal charges. This court is adjourned. Derek was led away to begin a sentence that would end only with his death, while Lauren began the much longer and harder process of building a life with the body and the trauma he'd left her. Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, became Derek Hayes' permanent home following his sentencing, a maximum security facility housing violent offenders where his status as a man who'd poisoned his postpartum wife made him deeply unpopular among fellow inmates. Prison has its own moral code, and men who harm women and children occupy the lowest tier of that hierarchy, subject to isolation and threat, and the kind of judgment that makes every day dangerous. Derek was placed in protective custody almost immediately, a classification that kept him separated from general population, but also meant 23 hours a day in a cell roughly the size of a parking space, with 1 hour for recreation in a small yard surrounded by concrete walls, topped with razor wire. His appeals process began immediately after sentencing, his public defender filing motions challenging evidentiary rulings and jury instructions, and sufficiency of evidence, standard post-conviction procedure that rarely succeeds, but represents the last avenue for someone facing life in prison. Every appeal was denied. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals found no reversible error in Judge Brooks's handling of the trial, determined that evidence was overwhelming and properly admitted, concluded that Derek had received fair proceedings, and that his conviction was supported by facts that left no reasonable doubt about his guilt. Derek exhausted his state appeals within 2 years, and attempted federal habeas corpus relief arguing constitutional violations, but those petitions were dismissed for failure to state viable claims. By 2022, Derek's legal options were essentially exhausted. His conviction and sentence final, his remaining years, reduced to the grinding routine of prison life without possibility of release. In 2022, Derek agreed to an interview with an investigative journalist writing a book about the case, perhaps motivated by ego or boredom or some need to control his narrative even from prison. The interview was conducted via video call from the prison's legal visitation area, Derek appearing on camera thinner than during trial, his face harder, his demeanor defensive. When asked directly if he felt remorse for what he'd done to Lauren, Derek gave an answer that revealed he still hadn't accepted full responsibility for his actions. "I regret how everything turned out," he said carefully. "Lauren didn't deserve what happened to her, but I was in a bad place mentally, dealing with financial pressure and stress about becoming a father, and I made decisions I wish I could take back." The journalist pressed him on specifics, on whether he acknowledged poisoning Lauren deliberately, and Derek deflected. The jury believed the prosecution's version of events. "I maintain that things were more complicated than they presented, that there were factors the evidence didn't fully capture, but I've accepted. That's my reality now." He claimed Lauren had been suffering from postpartum depression and suggested without evidence that she might have consumed the mushroom toxin intentionally or accidentally, a theory so divorced from facts and so insulting to a woman who'd lost 4 limbs that the journalist called him out directly for victim blaming. Derek became defensive, ending the interview shortly after, but the damage was done. The excerpts published from that interview showed a man fundamentally incapable of accepting responsibility, still making excuses, still trying to shift blame onto his victim even years after being convicted. Lauren, when told about the interview, declined to comment publicly except to say through her attorney that Derek's continued denial was unsurprising and that she'd moved on with her life in ways he never could, trapped forever in a prison both literal and psychological of his own making. Prison psychologists who evaluated Derek as part of routine assessments noted narcissistic personality traits, lack of genuine empathy, and persistent externalization of blame for his circumstances. He participated minimally in available programs, kept to himself in protective custody, wrote occasional letters to his mother that she rarely answered. His mother had issued a public statement after his conviction saying she didn't recognize the man her son had become, that she grieved for Lauren and Caleb, that she couldn't support Derek's actions or defend his choices. That rejection, perhaps more than the legal consequences, seemed to affect Derek deeply, leaving him isolated even from the minimal family connections that might have provided some emotional support during incarceration. He would spend the rest of his life in that small cell, decades stretching ahead with nothing but time to think about the future he'd destroyed for $500,000 he never received and a freedom he'd never experience again. Lauren Mitchell Hayes' case resonated far beyond Wake County, North Carolina, becoming a reference point in discussions about domestic violence, postpartum vulnerability, and the ways that trust can be weaponized by people who see relationships as transactions rather than sacred bonds. Medical conferences featured presentations about her case, emphasizing how amatoxin poisoning can mimic postpartum sepsis and highlighting the importance of expanded toxicology testing when symptoms don't align with typical infection patterns. Several hospitals revised their protocols following Lauren's case, implementing mandatory toxicology screens for unexplained postpartum organ failure, changes that have since identified 2 additional poisoning cases that might otherwise have been misattributed to natural complications. The domestic violence community embraced Lauren's story as well, using her experience to educate about warning signs of coercive control and financial abuse that often precede physical violence. Statistics show that pregnancy increases risk of domestic violence, that abusers often escalate during periods when their partners are most vulnerable, that financial stress can trigger violence in relationships where control dynamics already exist. Lauren's case illustrates these patterns with devastating clarity. Derek's increasing distance during pregnancy, his resentment of financial obligations, his construction of an alternate life with another woman, his calculation that Lauren's death would solve all his problems simultaneously. By 2021, Lauren had progressed enough in her physical rehabilitation to begin speaking publicly about her experience, partnering with domestic violence organizations to share her story at conferences and community events. She appeared via video at first, self-conscious about her prosthetic limbs and concerned about public reaction, but she discovered that her vulnerability was precisely what made her testimony powerful. People heard her story and understood viscerally how quickly safety can transform into danger, how the person sleeping beside you can harbor intentions you'd never imagine, how survival sometimes requires accepting loss and rebuilding from a foundation you never asked for. Lauren established a foundation in 2022 focused on supporting survivors of domestic violence who'd sustained permanent injuries, providing resources for adaptive equipment and therapeutic services and legal advocacy. Caleb, who was barely 2 days old when his father poisoned his mother, will grow up knowing his origin story is complicated and painful. Lauren has been working with therapists to determine how and when to explain this to him in age-appropriate ways, how to help him understand that none of what happened was his fault, that he was loved and wanted despite his father's actions. She has full custody with Derek's parental rights terminated following his conviction, and Derek is prohibited from contact even by mail. Lauren lives with her mother in a modified home designed for accessibility, managing prosthetic limbs that require constant maintenance and adjustment, coping with phantom limb pain that wakes her some nights, working through trauma that manifests in hypervigilance and trust issues. But she also works with Caleb to build new traditions and new definitions of normal, teaching him that different doesn't mean less, that strength comes in forms beyond physical ability, that surviving something terrible doesn't define you unless you let it. 4 years after Derek poisoned her, in October 2023, Lauren recorded a final statement for this documentary, words meant to encapsulate what she'd learned through unimaginable suffering. "Evil doesn't always announce itself," she said. "Sometimes it looks like your husband, sounds like promises and wedding vows, comes wrapped in the ordinary routine of daily life." Derek didn't look like someone capable of murder. He didn't act like a monster most of the time, and that's what made him dangerous. He hid his intentions behind a normal face until the moment he decided my death was more valuable to him than my life. I survived because doctors were smart enough to test for poison when symptoms didn't make sense, because detectives were thorough enough to find video evidence Derek thought was buried. But I'm not whole, and I'll never be whole again. Every morning I wake up without hands and legs, I'm reminded that someone I loved tried to kill me. That's my reality forever because Derek chose insurance money over my life. Her message to anyone who might recognize warning signs in their own relationships was direct and urgent. If someone you love shows sudden personality changes, becomes secretive about finances, seems resentful about your relationship or your children, pulls away emotionally while maintaining superficial normalcy, trust your instincts. Ask questions. Seek help. Don't assume love will protect you, because sometimes the person you love most is the person planning to hurt you worst. The documentary ends not with Derek in his cell or with the courtroom where justice was served, but with Lauren and Caleb in a park near their home. Caleb, now almost 4 years old, runs ahead on sturdy toddler legs while Lauren follows on prosthetics that allow her to walk but not run. Her mechanical hands hold a phone to capture video of her son's joy. The image is simultaneously heartbreaking and hopeful, a reminder that survival means carrying forward despite loss, that motherhood persists even when the body that bears it has been irrevocably changed, that Caleb's laughter exists because Lauren fought to stay alive even when death might have been easier. The final shot fades to information about domestic violence resources, Lauren's foundation contact details, and statistics about postpartum abuse, leaving viewers with both the weight of Lauren's story and the tools to recognize danger in their own lives or the lives of people they love. Thank you for watching this documentary and for bearing witness to Lauren's story. If this case impacted you, please remember to like this video, share it with people who need to see it, and subscribe to this channel for more in-depth true crime documentaries that examine not just the crimes themselves, but the human cost and the systems that either fail or succeed in delivering justice. Lauren's story continues, and your support helps ensure stories like hers reach the audiences that need to hear them most. Stay safe, stay aware, and never ignore your instincts when something feels wrong.